John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com, covers the Eagles, covers the NFL. He joins us now on the Boardwalk Honda hotline as the Eagles getting ready for the Bears. John, we asked John Mullen, not John McMullen, last hour. We asked him if the Bears were for real, or are they one of those surprise teams that kind of like the one and done, team that, hey, nice season, but you're out. He said he didn't know the answer to the question. He said, I really can't get a feel of whether or not this team's for real or if they're just kind of a one and done. We went through their schedule. They really, when we look back at it, their best win of the year, they beat Seattle back in week 2. They beat the Rams. And other than that, there's not much on that schedule that you're like, oh, they've had a pretty – it's very, one of those teams that you're just like looking for something that stands out impressively about them. And he even said – he didn't think that their defense was as good as people are giving them credit for. So would you look at this Bears team and say they're for real, or do you think that they're more of a surprise at 12-4?
Oh, definitely a surprise at 12-4, and we went through this last season. Understand now they play the last place schedule. And that helps. And we talk about that all the time in the NFL. It's difficult to sustain success when you go from sort of that surprise team and then you got to play the first place schedule. And that's why somebody like New England has been so impressive over the years. And that's why, to a certain degree, the Eagles struggle. It's a much more difficult road. Doesn't necessarily mean you're not a good football team, as the Eagles proved last year. They went from worst in the NFC East to Super Bowl champions. But in the regular season, that definitely helps you. And so I think we all look at teams like that and say, well, you have to wait and see if they're for real. I think from the Bears' perspective, it's even more difficult because of the quarterback. And not a lot of people believe in the quarterback. But I am surprised at what John said about that defense. That defense looks really good to me, and it looks really good at all three levels. And I often talk about any defense can be scored on because this is the modern NFL, and I include the Bears with that. If you can pass protect and you can hold up on the offensive front, you can score on anybody. But that's easier said than done. However, that's one of the matchups I kind of favor for the Eagles. Not to say their offensive line is going to be better than the Chicago defensive front, just that they're capable. And if you're capable, it's not something that front is used to because they're used to dominating. Yeah, and,
obviously when you look at that team, everybody looks at Khalil Mack. He has been the big name. They got the trade. And, they had that game early in the year against the Green Bay Packers on opening night that they ended up losing that game. But it was a surprise. They were up big, and they were kind of that surprise team early. You were like, oh, and they lost that game. You're like, oh, but they might be good. You look through at Khalil Mack and what he's brought to that defense. It really adds that element of they've got that star player that you have to game plan for. Does that add to why their defense is so good?
Well, it does. But I think I'll tell you this, because Khalil Mack was every bit as good on the Oakland Raiders, and they weren't a dominant defense. So it takes more than that. And I think it's sort of the final piece to have that dominant edge rusher, and he deserves all the credit you can throw at him. But I think the key player on that defense is Akeem Hicks. He has been an absolute wrecking ball in the middle of that defensive line. And nobody knows about him. I would argue, other than Aaron Donald, other than Fletcher Cox, he is the best interior defensive lineman in the NFL this season. And that is sort of, now you got both of them. Now what do you do? And then the complementary guys, Leonard Floyd. If Leonard Floyd is your top edge rusher, you probably have some issues. But when he's the second guy, you're really good. When Eddie Goldman is your top, interior defensive lineman, they play a 3-4. So essentially, you're talking about 5 technique guys and all that. But you're probably not very good. But when he's your second guy, you're really good.
Yeah.
And so it's all kind of fit into place by getting Khalil Mack. But Akeem Hicks is just as valuable, and some would argue, including me, he's been even more valuable.
Yeah, the 3-4. Look, we talked a little bit about this yesterday. Did I read correctly that the Eagles plan on going back to Sayamala this week?
It looks that way. We'll probably get a better indication. They had practice today. I just got back from practice, and he was taking the first-team reps next to Jason Kelsey. So it certainly seems to indicate he will be starting at left guard for the Eagles. And that, to me, is a bit of a surprise, to be honest, because, we talk about this little stretch in this 3-game run, and everybody talks about Nick Foles. One of the other aspects of that little 3-game run is Wisniewski being back in at left guard. Darren Sproles as well, I would say, is key, being in it, being a key piece of the offense at running back.
Keep in mind, Wisniewski was also the starting left guard in the playoff run last year.
Well, exactly, and they're winning games. So usually when you're winning games, you don't want to make a lot of changes. But it's evident that the Eagles feel they need that athleticism that Isaac Sayamala provides for the exact reason I just mentioned, to match up with a guy like Akeem Hicks, who's extremely athletic, extremely fast off the ball. So I think they're trying a matchup type thing. I'm not sure I agree with it. I'd rather have the veteran savvy in there, but we'll see how it works out. It definitely looks like they're going to turn towards Isaac Sayamala, who hasn't played since the Dallas game. Mm-hmm. So he hasn't played in any of these 3 wins to end the regular season.
Anything new with Mike Wallace?
No, Mike, the way Doug talked earlier this week, he was going to continue to do individual work. That is sort of borne out, and I think it's unlikely he'll play. And if they keep going, he'll get closer and closer, but obviously, if they lose the game, we're probably not going to see Mike Wallace. I would doubt that he's going to play in this game, and the Eagles seem pretty comfortable in the way they've shifted offensively down the stretch, and that's with a lot of 12 personnel, 2 tight ends with Dallas Goedert being out there. And then when they do go to 3 receivers, they put Golden Tate in to be the slot guy. So they seem to have settled on that, and I think that's what you're going to see the rest of the way, no matter how long it goes.
Yeah, and, you mentioned the 3-4. Danny Trevathan, he's a guy that's a veteran from Denver. Roquan Smith, though, he's a young guy, rookie, who's been a big change in that defense as well that doesn't get a lot of attention because of Mack.
Yeah, not a lot of guys. I mean, they have, you mentioned Roquan Smith. They have, I mentioned Hicks. You talk about Eddie Jackson. I think one of the keys is, can he play? How healthy is he going to be? Big playmaker at safety, Kyle Fuller, all the interceptions, even Prince and Mukamura. They've got playmakers at every level. But you know what? It all comes from that front. It really does, because they put so much pressure on the quarterback. That's why you create these turnovers, because you always have quarterbacks sped up, or they're behind the sticks because of a tackle for loss, or maybe it's a false start because you're worried about Floyd and Mack on the edges. So everything stems from that front, but they do have good players on the back 7 as well. Smith is a really talented guy, but he's a rookie, and you can do some things to probably expose him as well. I think 2-3 years down the road, we're going to be talking about a really good player.
Are you, if you were to guess right now that offensively for Philly, this feels like a who game? An Ertz game, a Jeffrey game, an Aguilar game, one of the running backs. I mean, I guess you can't really pinpoint one of them, but Sproles maybe, but is there a guy
it's a big spot, and you got to get the football out of your hands quickly. So that says to me Darren Sproles in key situations. And I think it's going to be a little ironic in some ways, because I think the key from the Bears' perspective offensively is Tariq Cohen, who a lot of people sort of say is the new age Darren Sproles. So I think Darren is going to be really, really important to this offense,
right?
Because they have to get the football out of Nick Foles' hands quickly. And we always know, when I say these things, everything is sort of second to Zach Ertz. I mean, Zach Ertz is the guy in this offense, and obviously he's going to get a lot of traffic. He's going to be very important. But if you're looking for a bit of a surprise and who has the opportunity to make some plays, I think it's going to be Darren Sproles, especially in key situations, third downs and big spots.
What we talk a lot about their pass rush. How do they, Josh Adams, Wendell Smallwood, those guys have been, especially Smallwood has been a little bit more effective, and they've used him in more the last couple of weeks. I mean, could you see a situation where Doug says, you know what, I'm going to go to my run game this week?
Boy, no, I mean, nobody can run on this team. Nobody's been able to run consistently on this team all year. And if you're going to be honest, I mean, the Eagles just don't have a lot of talent at running back. That's not the strength of this offense. So I don't know. I mean, you have to do it to keep the defense honest. So I'm not saying you want to throw it 50 times and not try to run it at all. I just think it's going to be more similar to that Houston game. You're not going to have a lot of success running the football. So you're going to have to make plays elsewhere. And I think other aspects of the passing game as far as moving the football are going to be more important. I just can't see Wendell, Smallwood, Josh. I can't see them running consistently on this defense.
More on this game tonight. Mosher, McMullen, and Krause at the Landmark at 6 o'clock. They will have a lot more in-depth coverage of Eagles and Bears here on 97.3 ESPN. I do want to get into some NFL stuff with you, John, as we get deeper into the week here. Number one, we've got 8 coaching vacancies. Vic Fangio is up for one of those, by the way, or multiple ones. I believe Denver and maybe a couple others. But there's 8 openings right now, and it seems that some of their maybe not surprises, but, I think most of the people that got fired, I don't think there's really like a guy that jumped off the page at you here. But the team that, to you, we talked about a little bit yesterday, that the Cleveland situation seems like the one that most people would say is the best. But for you, which team, if you're a head coach for your first time, do you want to jump into?
Well, I tend to look at things a little bit differently because I think the key to success in this league, I mean, people are going to look at quarterbacks, obviously, and that's why they say Cleveland. But I'll point to something else, and I'll say bad ownership. And the last thing you want to get involved in is bad ownership because essentially, something is going to go wrong down the road. So I would still say Green Bay from that perspective, to me, is the best situation because it's the most stable one. It's rarely open for good reason. Obviously, you still have a tremendous quarterback as well. So I look at that. And then perhaps the Jets because, Woody Johnson's kind of taken a step back for now. And they have who I think is going to be a good quarterback down the road in Sam Darnold. But I do like Baker Mayfield a lot. I just don't trust Jimmy Haslam to do the right things consistently as far as that front office and how they run things.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. You got the Bengals situation where Lewis has been there so long and he's finally out. It looks like McDaniels has already said, I don't want to even interview there because of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, you talk about ownership in that situation with Cincinnati. It's not continuity. Obviously, they stuck with Marvin for 16 years. It's more about cheapness, to be honest, and the fact that they're not going to go the extra mile as far as we always talk about salary cap and what the cap is going to be for the roster. Well, there is no cap for sort of things like coaching staffs and personnel staffs and facilities and the way you do things off the field. Jerry Jones would be number one as far as that category goes. And Cincinnati's never been willing to spend on those types of things, and that just makes it more difficult for you.
You got Arizona, another one that their ownership has been, they were always thought to be really cheap and poor, and I say poor in terms of poor functioning, not poor like, although cheap and poor I guess would be similar, but they had a little run of success there with Arians, and then they've been a little rocky the last couple of years. Is that attractive at all?
Well, obviously they're coming off a one-and-done situation, so that causes you pause. And they kept the GM, Steve Keim, and fired the coach. So this will be his last opportunity. So I don't see a lot of stability there. So it wouldn't sort of leap out at me and say, this is a great situation, because all of a sudden if you get hired and then they fire the GM and then you have a new GM and he might want to bring in his own guy.
Yeah.
So all these things have to come into play. And generally, let's be honest, very rarely are good organizations looking for head coaches for a reason. And it's the same names over and over, same organizations every few years. And that's why I default again back to Green Bay, because of the stability, of the fact that they're not always looking for a head coach. If you do your job, you're going to be there for a long time. You're going to have the support staff and the setup to succeed. And that's rare in this league because, for obvious reasons, if you're successful, you don't make a lot of changes.
Tampa Bay is looking for a new coach as well, and Miami. Those two, like Miami, Gaze is interesting. They just brought him. He was one of the guys that Philly liked. He was one of the guys in the same year as Doug Peterson. Every guy is gone from the Peterson class. They're all fired.
Every single one of them. 7 out of, Doug Peterson was number 7. So many people on that list said he was the worst hire. I always, Mike Lombardi gets all the criticism because of his over-the-top words, but there were so many who laughed at this team, and they all sort of hide in the shadow of Mike Lombardi. And it's a perfect example. And by the way, the Eagles themselves can crow all they want, but they wanted Adam Gase first. The reason Adam Gase was not the head coach here is because he wanted too much power as far as the roster went. They were just coming off the Chip Kelly disaster, and they hesitated. So he went to Miami. That worked out. Ben McAdoo was on the New Jersey Turnpike, the legend goes, to take this job. And the New York Giants.
What's he doing now?
Turn around. Good question. I don't.
He's not in the league as a coordinator, a position coach, nothing.
No, he's definitely not a coordinator. I do not believe he landed anywhere as an assistant, but I would have to double check that. He will be back in the league. It's sort of, you take a step back and hope people forget. And I think he'll even be a coordinator. So I'm not trying to say that, but he'll be back in the league when he wants to be back in the league. However, it would have been a disaster. And Doug Peterson was the Eagles' third choice. And sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. Some people will say fourth choice because some people said they had real interest in Tom Coughlin. I don't necessarily believe that.
Right.
But they definitely wanted Adam Gase. I know that for a fact. He was number 1. And McAdoo was going to take the job and turned around when the Giants upped their offer. So at best, he was number 3. And it's worked out, obviously, brilliantly.
Denver's open as well. There's some interesting teams that are open. Denver's a tradition. This is the first time they had back-to-back losing seasons in 30 years or something like that. So Denver historically a very strong foundation, but the quarterback situation there has been a mess since the Peyton Manning couple of years there, but they have not been able to find anybody. Yeah,
that would be the other team organizationally, at least, that you could say project maybe there's some stability, but even that, because John Elway's finally getting some criticism. And he's going to have to turn this thing around quick. And then obviously the Pat Bowlen, and the sort of shifting in the front office. But long term, that organization has been very stable. You would expect it to continue.
That would be an interesting one, John, if he never, that whole Peyton Manning situation just kind of fell in their laps because, Luck was the number one pick, so they ended up getting rid of him, and then the Denver was the one that was there. But if they never get Peyton Manning, they have not been able to get a quarterback since Elway.
No, and it's hard to get quarterbacks. It really is. And that's one of the reasons the Eagles are in such a good position with Carson Wentz and Nick Foles. But you see a guy like John Elway, who obviously is one of the best quarterbacks of all time, and you would think if anybody understands quarterback position, it's John Elway. And even he can't find a good quarterback. It's not easy.
Some of the candidates, who are some of the names you like?
Well, I think, there's two ways to think about it. And I do agree with the mentality that you should probably go for an offensive-minded guy. And everybody wants the next Sean McVay, and everybody wants the next Matt Nagy, and sort of the young offensive mind. But if you do go that way, Zach Taylor, the brother of Press Taylor, the Eagles quarterbacks coach, is one of those guys, quarterbacks coach in the Rams under Sean McVay. He's sort of the hot guy as far as the young, innovative mind. But if you look at those two situations, the Rams and Bears, look at the defensive coordinators, Wade Phillips in Los Angeles, Vic Fangio in Chicago. If you are going to go that route, you better have that great defensive coordinator and the ability to hire him. The other way is the Doug Peterson route, and I put Anthony Lynn in this category as well, and that's leadership. We always talk about X's and O's. We always talk about play calling, but I will argue to my dying day that the most important part of this job is managing personalities and keeping everybody on the same page. It's the most difficult thing to do. And Doug has been brilliant at it. And I think people don't give that aspect of the job enough sort of respect. And that's where I look at Cleveland and say, look at what Greg Williams, you know all the criticism. Look at what he was able to do with that organization, with that Baker Mayfield. He's not an offensive guy, but he's a leader, and he was able to manage the personalities. And he's not getting
that job back, though, is he?
No, I don't think so. And I think people are making a mistake when they dismiss sort of guys who are great leaders in favor of, I don't know what you want to describe them, because I don't want to criticize Sean McVay and Matt Nagy, because I think they're both brilliant. But A, I think it's hard to find guys like that. And B, there's other parts of it you need in place. And that's why I bring up Wade Phillips and Vic Fangio, because they wouldn't be successful without those guys. So it's sort of like you need more than the coach.
Yeah.
And my preference would be to get the leader like a Doug Peterson, but that's difficult to do as well.
All right, John McMullen, more tonight on the Eagles and the Bears, the NFL playoffs. He is live from 6 to 8. Mosher, McMullen, and Krause. That's from the Landmark in Glassboro, right after us here on 97.3 ESPN. All right, John, we'll talk tomorrow, pal.
All right, thanks, Mike.